The metal doors of the prison transport bus slammed shut with a sound that echoed through the morning air. Inside, a woman sat quietly in the back row, her hands cuffed behind her back, watching the world pass by through the small, reinforced window. The other passengers on the bus were mostly silent too, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Collins, though nobody on that bus knew her real identity. To them, she was just another person heading to serve time at Riverside Correctional Facility. She wore expensive clothes that stood out among the standard-issue transport uniforms, a designer blazer, diamond earrings that caught the light, and shoes that probably cost more than most people made. In a month, the bus rumbled down the highway, past farms and small towns, carrying its passengers toward their new reality. Rebecca had made this journey many times before, but never like this. Never as someone who would be staying behind those walls. For 15 years, she had been a federal judge, someone who decided the fates of others. Now she was about to experience the other side of the justice system firsthand. As the bus pulled through the massive gates of Riverside Correctional Facility, Rebecca felt her heart racing despite her calm exterior. The facility looked exactly like what it was, a place designed to keep people locked away from the world. High concrete walls topped with razor wire stretched as far as the eye could see. Guard towers stood at each corner, their windows reflecting. The harsh morning sun. The bus came to a stop in a loading area surrounded by more walls and gates. Through the window, Rebecca could see several guards waiting for them. One of them immediately caught her attention, a tall man with broad shoulders, who seemed to be in charge of the group. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge polished to a shine, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that came from years of working in this environment. This was Officer Rick Johnson, though Rebecca didn't know his name yet. Johnson had been working at Riverside for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed very strong opinions about the people who ended up in his facility. He especially disliked what he called the privileged ones, people who had money and status on the outside, but found themselves on the wrong side of the law. As the transport officer began calling names for the new arrivals to exit the bus, Johnson watched through the reinforced glass. When he saw Rebecca step down from the bus, still wearing her expensive clothes and jewelry, his jaw tightened. Everything about her screamed money and privilege to him. The way she carried herself, the quality of her clothes, even the way she looked around at her surroundings, it all reminded him of people he believed looked down on working folks like him. Johnson had grown up in a small town where his family struggled to make ends meet. His father had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and his mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families who treated her like she was invisible. When he saw people like Rebecca, all he could think about was how unfair life was, how some people had everything handed to them while others had to fight for every scrap. The intake process began in a large, sterile room with concrete floors and fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and harsh. One by one, the new arrivals were processed through the system. When Rebecca's turn came, she stepped forward to the desk where Johnson was handling the paperwork. He looked at her intake form and then back at her, his expression showing clear disapproval. The charges listed were financial crimes, the kind that usually involve people with access to large amounts of money. To Johnson, this confirmed everything he already thought about her. So, another rich girl who thought she could play fast and loose with other people's money, he said, not looking up from the paperwork. His voice was loud enough for others in the room to hear, which was exactly what he intended. Rebecca remained silent, keeping her eyes focused straight ahead. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. But her silence only seemed to irritate Johnson more. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he continued, finally looking up at her. "I bet you had plenty to say when you were spending money that wasn't yours. I bet you felt real important then." The truth was far more complicated than Johnson could have imagined. Rebecca wasn't at Riverside because she had committed any crime. She was there as part of an elaborate federal investigation into corruption that reached the highest levels of government. For months, she had been working secretly with federal agents to expose a network of corrupt officials who had been manipulating the justice system for their own gain. The investigation had required her to go deep undercover, and the only way to get close enough to the people they needed to catch was for her to appear to be one of their victims. So she had agreed to be arrested on fake charges, to be processed through the system like any other prisoner, and to endure whatever came next. It was dangerous and difficult, but it was the only way to gather the evidence they needed to bring down the entire operation. But Johnson knew none of this. All he saw was what appeared to be another wealthy person who had finally faced consequences for their actions. And he intended to make sure she understood exactly where she stood now. As the intake process continued, Johnson made sure to take his time with Rebecca's paperwork. While other new arrivals were processed quickly and efficiently, he found reasons to double-check her information, to ask additional questions, and to make her wait longer than necessary. "You know what I find interesting about people like you?" he said while pretending to review her forms. "You spend your whole lives thinking you're better than everyone else. You drive fancy cars, live in big houses, and look down on the rest of us like we're beneath you. But look where that got you." Rebecca continued to remain silent. But inside she was already beginning to understand the dynamic she would be dealing with during her time at Riverside. She had seen this before in her courtroom, people who let their personal feelings and prejudices cloud their professional judgment. The difference was that in her courtroom she had the power to maintain order and ensure fairness. Here, she was completely at the mercy of people like Johnson. The other new arrivals watched the interaction with interest. Some seemed uncomfortable with Johnson's behavior, while others appeared to enjoy seeing someone they also perceived as privileged being taken down a notch. Rebecca noticed all of this, filing away information that might be useful later. Finally, the intake process was complete, and it was time for Rebecca to be escorted to her cell. Johnson personally took charge of this task, something that wasn't usually required for routine transfers. But he wanted to make sure Rebecca understood her new reality from the very beginning. As they walked through the corridors of the prison, Johnson kept up a steady stream of commentary designed to intimidate and belittle. He pointed out the harsh conditions, the strict rules, and the consequences for not following orders. He made it clear that her previous life meant nothing here, and that she would be treated exactly like every other prisoner, or worse, if she didn't show proper respect. What Johnson didn't realize was that with every word, every gesture, every unnecessary humiliation, he was being carefully observed and mentally documented by someone who understood the legal system better than he could imagine. Rebecca was already building a case in her mind, not just for the investigation that had brought her here, but for the systematic abuse of power she was witnessing firsthand. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately expose not just the corruption Rebecca had come to investigate, but the everyday injustices that happened when authority went unchecked and people were judged by their appearance rather than their actions. The first week at Riverside Correctional Facility passed like a blur of concrete walls, metal bars, and the constant sound of doors slamming shut. Rebecca had quickly learned the daily routine. Wake up at 5 in the morning, stand for count. Eat breakfast in the cafeteria, report for work assignments, eat lunch, more work, dinner, and lights out by 9. It was a rhythm designed to break down individuality and create compliance, but Officer Johnson had other plans for Rebecca. From the very first morning, he made it clear that her experience would be different from the other inmates. While most new arrivals were given simple jobs like folding laundry or working in the library, Johnson personally assigned Rebecca to the worst duties available. "Collins," he called out during the morning work assignment, his voice echoing through the concrete corridor. "You're on bathroom detail, all of them. Every single toilet, sink, and shower in C block." The other inmates exchanged glances. Bathroom detail was usually rotated among several people and was considered one of the most unpleasant jobs in the facility. Having one person responsible for an entire block was almost unheard of, and everyone knew it. Rebecca picked up her cleaning supplies without complaint and headed to begin her work. The bathrooms in C block were exactly what you would expect from a place housing hundreds of people with minimal maintenance. The smell hit her as soon as she opened the first door, and she had to pause for a moment to steady herself. Johnson appeared behind her, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "What's wrong, Princess? Not what you're used to," he said with a smirk. "I bet the bathrooms in your mansion were a little different, weren't they?" Rebecca began scrubbing the first toilet without responding. She had learned that engaging with Johnson only encouraged him to continue his harassment. But her silence seemed to frustrate him even more. "You know what your problem is?" Johnson continued, leaning against the doorframe. "You think if you just keep quiet and wait it out, this will all go away. You think someone's going to come rescue you because you're special. Well, let me tell you something, you're not special. Here, you're nobody." As the days turned into weeks, Johnson's treatment of Rebecca became more systematic and deliberate. He would wait until she was almost finished eating her meals, then call her away for some unnecessary task, leaving her hungry. When other inmates received mail or visitors, he would delay delivering Rebecca's correspondence or find excuses to cancel her visiting privileges. The worst part was the public humiliation. Johnson seemed to take particular pleasure in embarrassing Rebecca in front of the other inmates. During daily inspections, he would single her out, making her stand longer than others while he searched through her belongings. He would comment loudly about her soft hands and Prince's attitude, making sure everyone could hear. "Look at these hands," he would say, grabbing Rebecca's wrists during inspections. Never worked a day in her life. Probably had servants to do everything for her. The other inmates would watch these displays with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the ones being targeted, but Rebecca was far from helpless. During her 15 years as a federal judge, she had developed an extraordinary ability to observe and remember details. Every interaction with Johnson, every violation of protocol, every abuse of authority was being carefully catalogued in her mind. She noticed that he treated other inmates differently based on their backgrounds, showing favoritism to some while targeting others for harassment. She also began to understand the complex social dynamics within the prison. There was Maria, a young woman serving time for drug possession, who had 2 small children on the outside and spent most of her time worrying about their welfare. There was Linda, an older woman who had been involved in a white-collar scheme and was now working in the prison library, helping other inmates with their legal paperwork. Rebecca found herself naturally gravitating toward helping these women, though she had to be careful not to reveal too much about her legal background. When Maria received a letter from social services threatening to place her children in foster care, Rebecca helped her draft a response that addressed the legal requirements while maintaining her parental rights. "How do you know so much about this stuff?" Maria asked one evening as they sat in the common area. Rebecca had prepared for this question. "I worked as a paralegal before all this happened," she said, which was technically true. She had worked as a paralegal early in her career, before law school. "You pick up things when you're around lawyers all the time." Johnson noticed these interactions and didn't like them one bit. He saw Rebecca's growing influence among the other inmates as a threat to his authority. In his mind, she was supposed to be broken down and isolated, not building relationships and helping others. So he escalated his campaign against her. One morning, he assigned Rebecca to kitchen duty, specifically working with the industrial dishwasher and grease traps. The work was hot, messy, and exhausting. The kitchen staff was already shorthanded, so Rebecca found herself working 12-hour shifts in sweltering heat, her hands raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals. "This is what real work looks like," Johnson told her on her first day in the kitchen. "None of that sitting behind a desk ordering people around. This is honest work, the kind of work real people do." The kitchen supervisor, Mrs. Chun, was a kind woman who had been working at the facility for over 20 years. She watched Johnson's behavior with growing concern, but knew that challenging him directly could cost her job. Instead, she tried to help Rebecca in small ways, making sure she got breaks when Johnson wasn't around, teaching her more efficient ways to do the work, and occasionally slipping her extra food. "Don't let him see you break," Mrs. Chun whispered to Rebecca one afternoon as they worked side by side. "Men like him feed on other people's pain. The moment you show weakness, He'll just get worse. Rebecca appreciated the advice, but she had no intention of breaking. Every day in that kitchen, every moment of harassment from Johnson, was providing her with invaluable insights into how the prison system really worked. She saw how staff members either participated in abuse or turned a blind eye to it. She witnessed the daily indignities suffered by inmates who had no voice and no recourse. The other inmates began to notice something different about Rebecca. Despite the harsh treatment she received from Johnson, she never complained or showed anger. She helped others when she could, shared what little she had, and treated everyone with respect regardless of their crimes or backgrounds. "There's something about that Collins woman," Linda mentioned to Maria one evening. "She doesn't act like the rest of us. It's like she's not really here, you know? Like she's watching everything but staying above it somehow." Maria nodded. "She helped me with that custody letter and the way she wrote it. It was like reading something a lawyer would write. I keep wondering what she really did before she came here." Johnson overheard part of this conversation, and it only fueled his determination to break Rebecca down. He began making surprise cell inspections, looking for any excuse to write her up for violations. He would force her to clean areas that had already been cleaned, then criticize her work and make her do it again. But with each passing day, Rebecca was building a detailed mental file not just on Johnson, but on the entire system of abuse and neglect she was witnessing. She was documenting everything: the overcrowding, the inadequate medical care, the arbitrary punishment, and most importantly, the staff members who either participated in or ignored the mistreatment of inmates. What Johnson didn't realize was that his campaign of harassment was actually helping Rebecca accomplish her real mission. By targeting her so specifically, he was revealing the depths of his corruption and abuse of power. And by forcing her into different areas of the prison, he was giving her access to information and experiences she might never have had otherwise. The stage was being set for a reckoning that Johnson couldn't possibly imagine. Every insult, every unnecessary punishment, every moment of humiliation was being carefully recorded by someone who understood exactly how the law worked and what constituted a violation of civil rights. Rebecca was building a case that would eventually bring down not just Johnson, but the entire corrupt system he represented. 3 months had passed since Rebecca arrived at Riverside Correctional Facility, and Officer Johnson's harassment had only gotten worse. What started as verbal taunts and extra work assignments had escalated into something much more serious. Johnson was no longer content with just making Rebecca's life difficult. He wanted to completely destroy her spirit and prove his power over her. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Rebecca had been assigned to clean the administrative offices, a job that required her to work alone in areas where there were fewer witnesses. As she mopped the floors in the records room, she heard Johnson's heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. Well, what do we have here?" Johnson said as he entered the room, closing the door behind him. His voice had a different tone than usual, more threatening, more personal. "All alone, just like I planned." Rebecca continued mopping, but every instinct told her that something was different about this encounter. Johnson's behavior had been escalating for weeks, and she had been documenting each incident, waiting for him to cross a line that would give her grounds for formal action. Johnson walked around the room slowly, pretending to inspect her work, while actually positioning himself between Rebecca and the door. "You know what I've been thinking, Collins? I've been thinking that you still don't understand your place here. After all this time, you still act like you're better than the rest of us." Rebecca stopped mopping and looked directly at him for the first time in weeks. "I've followed every rule and completed every assignment you've given me," she said calmly. "I don't know what more you want." Johnson's face darkened at her response. He wasn't used to inmates speaking to him directly, especially not with the quiet confidence that Rebecca displayed. "What I want is respect," he said, stepping closer. "What I want is for you to admit that your fancy life on the outside doesn't mean anything in here. What happened next would change everything." Johnson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be pills. Rebecca recognized them immediately. They looked like prescription medication. The kind that was strictly forbidden for inmates to possess without proper medical authorization. Funny thing, Johnson said with a cruel smile. I was just about to do a routine cell search, and I have a feeling I'm going to find something very interesting in your belongings. Something that's going to add a lot more time to your sentence. Rebecca felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of abuse of power she had been waiting for, concrete evidence of corruption that could be documented and prosecuted. You're planting evidence, she said quietly. Johnson laughed. Prove it. Who's going to believe a convicted criminal over a decorated prison guard? I've been working here for 8 years with a spotless record. You're just another inmate trying to cause trouble. But Johnson had made a critical mistake. He had finally revealed the true extent of his corruption, and he had done it to someone who understood exactly how to use that information against him. Rebecca knew that this moment would be the foundation of the case she was building, not just for her own protection, but for the federal investigation that had brought her here. I want to file a formal complaint, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the seriousness of the situation. Johnson's expression shifted from cruel amusement to genuine surprise. Most inmates in Rebecca's position would have been begging or trying to bargain with him. The fact that she was talking about filing complaints caught him completely off guard. A complaint? He laughed, but there was less confidence in his voice now. About what? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just doing my job. Rebecca looked directly into his eyes. You're threatening to plant evidence in my cell to extend my sentence unless I show you what you call proper respect. That's extortion. Abuse of authority and violation of my civil rights under federal law? The way Rebecca spoke, with precise legal terminology and complete confidence in her facts, sent a chill down Johnson's spine. For the first time since she had arrived, he was hearing something in her voice that didn't sound like a typical inmate. This sounded like someone who really understood the law. You think you're smart, don't you? Johnson said, but his bravado was beginning to crack. You think you can threaten me with your fancy words and legal talk? Let me tell you something. I've heard it all before from inmates who thought they were smarter than the system. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you of my intentions. I will be filing a formal complaint through the proper channels, documenting this incident and the pattern of harassment I've experienced since my arrival. I will be requesting a full investigation into your conduct. Johnson was starting to panic. Now, though he tried not to show it, the pills were still in his hand, and he realized that his plan had backfired completely. Instead of breaking Rebecca down, he had given her exactly what she needed to fight back. Nobody's going to listen to you, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're nobody here. You're just another criminal serving time. Rebecca began, gathering her cleaning supplies, preparing to leave the room. We'll see about that, she said simply. That evening, Rebecca sat in her cell with a borrowed pen and a few sheets of paper she had requested from the library. What she wrote over. The next several hours was unlike any complaint that had ever been filed at Riverside Correctional Facility. Using her 15 years of experience as a federal judge, she crafted a document that was precise, detailed, and legally devastating. She began with a comprehensive timeline of Johnson's harassment, starting from her first day at the facility. Every incident was documented with dates, times, locations, and witnesses when available. She described the extra work assignments, the delayed meals, the public humiliation, and the deliberate isolation from other inmates, but the real power of the complaint came from Rebecca's legal expertise. She didn't just describe what had happened, she explained exactly which laws and regulations had been violated, which constitutional rights had been infringed, and which federal statutes applied to Johnson's conduct. The attempted evidence planting was described in detail, with specific references to federal laws regarding obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations. Rebecca explained how Johnson's actions constituted a pattern of behavior that violated not just prison regulations, but federal criminal law. She wrote, Rebecca was careful to maintain her cover. She described herself as someone with paralegal Experience who had learned about prisoner rights through extensive research. She didn't reveal her true identity, but she made it clear that she understood the legal system far better than most inmates. The complaint was 12 pages long when she finished, typed on the library's computer during her designated recreation time. It read like something that could have been written by a civil rights attorney, with footnotes referencing specific court cases and federal regulations. When Rebecca submitted the complaint to the prison's Internal Affairs Division, it landed on the desk of Inspector Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of correctional investigations. Williams had seen thousands of inmate complaints over the years, most of them hastily written and legally unsophisticated. But this document was different. Williams read the complaint twice, then called her supervisor. "You need to see this," she said. "I've never seen anything like it from an inmate. Either this woman is a legal genius, or she had help from someone who knows the system inside and out." The supervisor, Deputy Warden Robert Martinez, was equally impressed when he read the complaint. "This is extraordinary," he said. "The level of detail, the legal citations, the systematic documentation, this reads like something a federal prosecutor would write." Within hours, the complaint had been forwarded to the warden's office and copies were sent to the State Corrections Department and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The quality and content of the document demanded immediate attention. Meanwhile, Johnson was beginning to realize that he had made a serious mistake. Word was spreading through the staff that an inmate had filed an unusually detailed complaint against him. He tried to find out more information, but the investigation was being handled at levels far above his authority. For the first time since Rebecca had arrived at Riverside, Johnson felt genuinely worried. He had always believed that his position gave him complete power over the inmates under his supervision. The idea that one of them could fight back effectively had never occurred to him, but Rebecca was just getting started. The complaint was only the beginning of a process that would ultimately expose not just Johnson's corruption, but the entire system that had allowed it to flourish unchecked for so long. The wheels of justice began turning faster than anyone at Riverside Correctional Facility had ever seen before. Within 48 hours of Rebecca filing her complaint, Inspector Patricia Williams had launched a full-scale investigation into Officer Johnson's conduct. What she discovered in those first few days shocked even her experienced team. Williams started by pulling Johnson's personnel file and reviewing his 8-year career at the facility. On paper, everything looked clean, no formal complaints, no disciplinary actions, and several commendations from supervisors. But Williams knew that the absence of complaints didn't necessarily mean the absence of problems. Sometimes it just meant that inmates were too scared or powerless to speak up. She began interviewing other staff members, starting with those who worked most closely with Johnson. The responses were telling. Some guards seemed nervous when asked about Johnson's methods, while others were openly supportive of his tough approach to inmate management. "Johnson keeps order," said Officer Mike Rodriguez during his interview. "These inmates need to understand who's in charge, and Rick makes sure they do. Maybe his methods are a little old school, but they work." But Williams also spoke with staff, members like Mrs. Chun from the kitchen, who painted a very different picture. "I've seen how he treats that Collins woman," Mrs. Chun said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else could hear. "It's not right. She works harder than anyone else, never causes trouble, but he goes out of his way to make her life miserable." The most revealing interviews came from the Internal Affairs team's conversations with other inmates. Williams knew that inmates were often reluctant to speak against guards, fearing retaliation. But Rebecca's detailed complaint had given them a framework to ask specific questions about Johnson's behavior. Maria, the young woman Rebecca had helped with her custody issues, was initially hesitant to talk. But when Williams explained that the investigation was already underway and that her cooperation could help protect other inmates, she opened up. "He picks favorites and he picks targets," Maria explained. "If you keep your head down and don't cause any trouble, he mostly leaves you alone. But if he decides he doesn't like you, your life becomes hell." Collins got targeted from day one because of how she dressed when she came in. He decided she was some kind of rich princess who needed to be taught a lesson. Linda, the older woman who worked in the library, provided even more damaging testimony. "I've been here for 2 years, and I've seen Johnson single out certain inmates for harassment. It's always the ones he thinks are too educated or too privileged. He seems to take it personally, like their success in life is somehow an insult to him." But the most significant development came when Williams decided to review the facility's security footage. Modern prisons have cameras in most common areas, and Williams wanted to see if Johnson's behavior could be documented visually. What she found was a treasure trove of evidence. Hours of footage showing Johnson singling Rebecca out during inspections, forcing her to wait longer than other inmates, and publicly humiliating her in ways that clearly violated prison protocols. The cameras had captured everything: the unnecessary searches, the delayed meal times, and the excessive work assignments. Most damaging of all was footage from the administrative area, where Johnson had confronted Rebecca with the planted evidence. While the cameras didn't have audio, they clearly showed Johnson entering the records room alone, then emerging with something in his hand before confronting Rebecca. The timeline matched Rebecca's account perfectly. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued her daily routine as if nothing had changed. She went to work, followed orders, and maintained the same quiet dignity she had shown since her arrival. But she was also continuing her real mission, documenting the systemic problems within the prison system, working closely with internal affairs investigators. Though they didn't realize the extent of her cooperation, Rebecca provided detailed information about other violations she had witnessed. She described inadequate medical care for inmates with chronic conditions, overcrowding in certain cell blocks, and staff members who regularly violated protocol. Her legal expertise proved invaluable in ways the investigators couldn't fully understand. When they asked her to clarify certain incidents or provide more details about policy violations, Rebecca's responses were so precise and legally sophisticated that Williams began to suspect there was more to this inmate than met the eye. "Collins seems to understand the legal system better than most attorneys I've worked with," Williams mentioned to her supervisor during one of their daily briefings. "Her written statements read like court documents, and she can cite regulations I've never heard of off the top of her head." Deputy Warden Martinez was equally puzzled. "Run a background check on her. See what her education level is, what kind of work she did before coming here. Something doesn't add up." But the background check only deepened the mystery. Rebecca's cover story held up under scrutiny. She appeared to be exactly what her file said she was. The investigators had no way of knowing that her identity had been carefully constructed by federal agents as part of a larger operation. As the investigation continued, Johnson's behavior became increasingly erratic. He knew something was happening, but he didn't know the full extent of what the investigators had discovered. His supervisor had told him that there was a routine inquiry into an inmate complaint, but Johnson could sense that this was anything but routine. He began treating Rebecca even more harshly, as if punishing her for daring to file the complaint in the first place. But every new incident of harassment was now being watched by investigators, who were building an ever stronger case against him. The breaking point came when Johnson made his biggest mistake yet. Frustrated by the ongoing investigation and convinced that Rebecca was somehow behind it all, he decided to escalate his campaign of intimidation. During a routine cell inspection, Johnson planted a small knife in Rebecca's mattress, a much more serious offense than the pills he had threatened her with before. Possession of a weapon could add years to an inmate's sentence and would certainly result in solitary confinement, but Johnson didn't know that internal affairs had been monitoring his every move. Williams had installed additional surveillance, specifically to watch Johnson's interactions with Rebecca, and the entire evidence-planting incident was captured on camera within minutes of Johnson's discovery of the weapon. Williams and her team were reviewing the footage. They watched as Johnson entered Rebecca's cell during her work shift, concealed something in her mattress, then returned later with another guard to conduct the random search. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Johnson had just committed a federal crime on camera, in full view of investigators who were already building a case against him. Williams immediately contacted the federal authorities. The case had grown beyond a simple internal disciplinary matter. It now involved federal crimes including evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. That evening, as Rebecca returned to her cell from kitchen duty, she found Johnson waiting for her with a triumphant expression on his face. "Well, Collins, looks like your complaining didn't help you much. We found something very interesting in your cell today." Rebecca looked at the weapon that Johnson held up, then looked directly into his eyes. "You planted that," she said calmly. Johnson's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Prove it. It's your word against mine, and I'm the one with the badge." "Actually," came a voice from behind him, "it's your actions against our cameras." Johnson spun around to see Inspector Williams approaching with 2 federal agents. His face went white as he realized what had happened. "Officer Johnson," Williams said formally, "you're under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Johnson's wrists, Rebecca watched quietly from her cell doorway. After months of abuse and harassment, justice was finally being served. But she knew this was only the beginning. The investigation Johnson's actions had triggered would ultimately expose the entire corrupt network that had brought her to Riverside in the first place. The hunter had become the hunted, and the real revelation was still to come. The morning of Rebecca's scheduled release arrived with an unusual buzz of activity throughout Riverside Correctional Facility. Word had spread among the staff that something big was happening, though most didn't know exactly what. Federal agents had been coming and going for weeks, and rumors were flying about high-level investigations and major arrests. Rebecca had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because of nerves, but because she was mentally preparing for what would be the most important day of her undercover operation. After 4 months of careful observation, systematic documentation, and patient endurance, the time had finally come to reveal the truth. In the warden's office, a meeting was taking place that would change everything. Warden Thomas Bradley sat behind his desk, flanked by Inspector Williams, Deputy Warden Martinez, and 3 federal agents who had been overseeing the broader investigation. The atmosphere in the room was tense with anticipation. "Gentlemen and ladies," said Agent Catherine Stone, the lead federal investigator, "what I'm about to tell you will explain a lot of things that haven't made sense over the past few months. The inmate you know as Rebecca Collins is not who she appears to be." Agent Stone opened a file and placed several documents on the warden's desk. "Her real name is Dr. Rebecca Collins, and she's a federal judge with 15 years of experience." On the bench, "She's been working undercover as part of a federal investigation into corruption within the prison system." The silence in the room was deafening. Warden Bradley stared at the documents in disbelief, while Inspector Williams suddenly understood why Rebecca's legal knowledge had seemed so extraordinary. "A federal judge?" Bradley whispered. "She's been here for 4 months. How is that possible?" Agent Stone explained the complex operation that had brought Rebecca to Riverside. "We've been investigating a network of corrupt officials who have been manipulating the justice system for their own benefit. Judge Collins volunteered to go undercover to gather evidence from the inside. Her arrest and conviction were completely fabricated as part of this operation." Deputy Warden Martinez shook his head in amazement. "That explains so much. The way she carried herself, the legal expertise, the way she handled Johnson's harassment. She wasn't just enduring it, she was documenting it." "Exactly," Agent Stone confirmed. "And thanks to her work, we now have evidence of systematic abuse, corruption, and civil rights violations that go far beyond Officer Johnson's individual actions. This facility has serious problems that need to be addressed." Meanwhile, in the main corridor of the prison, Rebecca was being escorted toward the processing center by Officer Linda Martinez, one of the few guards who had always treated inmates with respect. As they walked, other inmates gathered along the corridor, watching curiously. Rebecca had become something of a legend among them, the quiet woman, who had stood up to Johnson and somehow brought down the most feared guard in the facility. "Collins," called out Maria from behind the bars of her cell. "Good luck out there. Don't forget about us in here." Rebecca paused and looked back at the women she had come to know over the past 4 months. "I won't forget," she said simply. None of this was in vain. As they approached the main administrative area, Rebecca could see that this wasn't going to be an ordinary release. The corridor was filled with more officials than she had ever seen in one place at the facility. Warden Bradley was there, along with Inspector Williams, several federal agents, and other staff members she recognized. But the person she noticed immediately was Officer Johnson, standing in handcuffs between two federal marshals. His face was a mixture of confusion, anger, and growing fear. He had been told that he was being brought to witness the release of the inmate whose complaint had started his downfall, but he still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. "Bring Collins to the center of the corridor, Agent." Stone instructed Officer Martinez. Rebecca walked calmly to the designated spot, her head held high with the same dignity she had maintained throughout her entire ordeal. The other inmates who could see from their cells pressed against the bars. Sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary, Agent Stone stepped forward and addressed the assembled group. "Ladies and gentlemen, today marks the conclusion of a federal investigation that has been months in the making. The woman you know as inmate Rebecca Collins is actually Judge Rebecca Collins of the Federal District Court." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Johnson's legs nearly gave out as the full implications crashed over him. The woman he had spent months humiliating, the inmate he had targeted for harassment and abuse, was a federal judge. "For the past 4 months," Agent Stone continued, "Judge Collins has been working undercover to investigate corruption and abuse within the prison system. Her incarceration was completely voluntary and part of an official federal operation." "Warden." Bradley stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. "Your Honor, I want to apologize on behalf of this entire facility for any mistreatment you experienced during your time here. If I had known," Rebecca raised her hand gently to stop him. "Warden Bradley, the point of this operation was that you didn't know. The treatment I received was the same treatment that countless other inmates receive every day. The only difference is that I had the knowledge and resources to document it properly." She turned to address the broader group, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking in courtrooms. "What I witnessed here over the past 4 months represents a systematic failure to protect the civil rights and human dignity of incarcerated individuals." Officer Johnson's behavior was not an isolated incident. It was part of a culture that allows abuse to flourish unchecked. Johnson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're a judge? All this time you were a judge?" Rebecca looked directly at him, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, Officer Johnson, I'm a judge. And everything you did to me, every humiliation, every abuse of power, every violation of protocol, was done to a sitting federal judge who was carefully documenting your actions for use in a federal prosecution." The color drained completely from Johnson's face as he realized the magnitude of his situation. He had spent months harassing and abusing someone who had the power to send him to federal prison. Every cruel comment, every planted piece of evidence, every moment of harassment had been witnessed and recorded by someone who understood exactly which laws he was breaking. "Officer Johnson," Rebecca continued, "you will be facing federal charges for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. The evidence against you is overwhelming because I personally experienced and documented every incident." Agent Stone stepped forward with a folder in her hands. "Judge Collins, we have the paperwork for your official release and the restoration of your full judicial authority. Your service to this investigation has been invaluable." As Rebecca changed from her prison uniform back into her judicial robes, brought specially for this moment, the transformation was remarkable. The quiet, dignified inmate disappeared, replaced by the commanding presence of a federal judge, who had just completed one of the most important cases of her career. The other inmates who could see the proceedings erupted in cheers and applause. They understood that someone had finally stood up for them, someone who had experienced their daily reality and would now have the power to change it. "Judge Collins," Warden Bradley said formally, "what happens now?" Rebecca adjusted her robes and looked around at the facility that had been her home for 4 months. Now we begin the real work. This investigation has revealed systematic problems that require systematic solutions. There will be federal oversight, policy changes, and accountability measures put in place to ensure that what I experienced here never happens to another inmate. She turned one last time to Johnson, who was being led away by the federal marshals. Officer Johnson, you thought you had power over me because I was an inmate and you were a guard. But real power comes from justice, not from the abuse of authority. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way. As Rebecca walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility as a free woman and a federal judge, she carried with her not just the evidence of corruption she had gathered, but the voices of every inmate who had suffered in silence. Her 4 months behind bars had given her something no law book could teach, a deep understanding of how the justice system really worked for those at the bottom. The investigation she had helped complete would lead to major reforms, multiple prosecutions, and a new standard of accountability within the prison system. But more importantly, it had proven that justice could prevail, even in the darkest corners of the system, when someone with courage was willing to stand up for what was right.